For sure. In your consultant interview, and in fact in any medical job interview, you are going to be asked a question that goes, tell me about a time when X. And you'll be expected to come up with an example to share on the spot. So how do we choose the best examples to share and answer that question? Because we want something that makes us seem confident, but not too arrogant. We want something that makes us look fallible, but not too vulnerable. So how do we choose the right examples and the best examples? It's a really difficult balance. Here's the strategies that I use to choose good examples for this answer at interview. Before you're in your interview chair, sweating and trying to rack your brains for an example, actually there's plenty of opportunity to prepare for this question in advance. There's only so many types of examples that they're going to ask for, and they're all pretty predictable. Some examples might be a time when you had conflict with a colleague, a time when you've had conflict with a patient, a time when you received negative feedback, a time when you made a mistake, a time when you had to ask for help. There is a limited list of probably about 15 examples that you're going to be asked. If you can spend time before your interview thinking about these, coming up with good examples, then actually when they ask you this question, you're going to have the example to hand. So instead of spending your mental capacity trying to think of the best example, you can actually focus on how to present that example well. And that's the goal, is trying to prepare it as much in advance so that we can just be present and focus on the connection you're building with the interviewers during the interview. For your interview, you're going to have prepared lots of different examples in advance, examples that you've thought through and you can think how to present and put yourself forward in a good light. Remember that these examples don't only need to be used for a question that starts with tell me about a time when X. Actually, these are examples that could be and should be used in all other elements of your question answering, because examples are so good to help to add authenticity to what you're saying. So rather than saying I'm good at problem solving, you say I'm good at problem solving and here's a time when I problem solved and this is how. Remember to draw examples into all of your answers, not just the tell me about a time when question. How do we choose a good example to share in our interviews? Well, the example has to be authentic. It has to be true. Don't just make up a story because you think it'll put you in a good light. This is a terrible idea. You're going to end up getting caught up in it not sounding genuine, in making errors, in being challenged and asked follow-up questions that you can't answer. It's a bad idea. You've been in medicine for long enough to be able to come up with some actual, genuine, authentic answers, so make sure they are. You also want an example where there is not significant patient harm in the end. I have been on interview panels where interviewees have shared stories where something significant has happened to the patient. Now, these are genuine examples and they can still show the interviewee in a good light and show skills and how they handled that situation. But also the panel are then distracted thinking about what happened, whether there was any error on the part of the interviewer, what implications that has for their practice, and it's just a distraction. So it's not that we don't make mistakes, I know we do, but it's important to allow the panel to focus on you and how you handle situations, how you cope with pressure, because that's the reason they're asking you these questions. Don't choose an example where there was some significant event. It's going to just be a distraction. What they want is for you to show you've been in a difficult situation, but you were able to handle it. So it's less in the example about the story and more about what action you took to handle the situation. So remember that that is going to be the focus. So you want to choose an example where you were responsible for taking action to address the situation. You also want to show some vulnerability. They don't want to employ a superhero, or they might want to employ a superhero, but they know that superheroes don't exist, and so you wouldn't be bringing your genuine self. Showing some vulnerability, it's okay if you were apprehensive about the situation, if you found it difficult to cope with the conflict, you were unsure how to proceed, but what you want to show is that you did make a plan and you did come through it and make the right choices, make the right decisions and take the right actions. So make sure that you try and show some vulnerability. You're not aiming for showing that you're a perfect human or a robot. That's not who they want as a colleague. And then you want to show that you have shared learning in some way. So you want this example of a difficult situation to have improved your practice, and ideally that you've used it to improve the practice of the whole department. It's likely that this situation is a common situation. It's probably not unique to you, and it certainly shouldn't be a unique situation where only you could get yourself into. It's going to be something that happens across all of medicine, and therefore some shared learning, how you demonstrated to your department and improved practice there based on your experience would be good. If you use all of these things in combination, you're going to be able to choose examples that are excellent to share during your interview. You've prepared your examples in advance and the time has come, they've asked your question to tell me an example about X, and you have your example ready. It's helpful to use a framework, and the framework I use is IMSO, Incident, Mission, Steps, Outcome. I follow this every time, and it means that I'm going through the example and presenting it in with a good structure and covering all the bases that they want to hear. So, incident. This is where you share what happened. What was the incident and what occurred? Don't get bogged down in telling a lengthy story here. You want to have a succinct way to share your story, because remember, what they want to hear isn't about the story. I'm sure it's interesting, but they actually want to hear the rest of it. They want to hear what you wanted to do about it, what you did do about it, and then what your thoughts are on how you handled it. So the story, ideally, you should prepare in advance, is going to be a couple of sentences to explain. If it's a really lengthy thing with loads of detail and that you need all the context to understand it, then either choose a different example or explain it better. So an example of an incident might be, I was the lead clinician on a shift in ED. It was a really busy shift. It was late in the evening. There was a family that unfortunately had been waiting for a long time to see a specialty, and they were starting to get very frustrated, and actually that frustration then changed into being agitated and angry. And one of the patients came round to the desk and was shouting at the nursing staff aggressively, demanding to see the specialty right now. This is a good incident example, scenario that we are all familiar with that unfortunately does happen when families get frustrated at waiting for so long. I've given a bit of context. I was in charge, it was busy, so I described it in 2 sentences, but it's clear what the scenario is and where I sit in that scenario. Mission. What was your role? Because you need to be playing an active role. You're not going to be an observer in this situation, otherwise it's not a good example to use. In my scenario, my role is that I'm the person in charge. So I would say I knew that I was the person in charge of the medical side of the shift, and so I knew I had to take an active role in handling the situation, trying to diffuse it, and also to deal with the aggression that was being levelled at the nursing staff. So again, this is a succinct answer. You may have a more complicated role, which is fine, that could go on for longer. This is quite a simple scenario, but I'm stating that I knew that I was in charge, and I knew that I was the person who had to take some responsibility to handle the situation. So this makes it clear where I'm headed, what I'm going to do. Steps. What steps did you actually take to deal with the situation? So this is the practical bit. How did you handle it? What did you practically do? Because it's not just about explaining a situation. We're all aware that there's different situations, but we want to know, actually on the panel, we want to know, what did you do to deal with that situation effectively? In my scenario, I'm going to think of the steps in different areas, and that's normally how I think about the examples I use. So the first thing is always going to be something related to the patient care, because that's going to be your priority. Or you may want to think about the safety of your staff in this case. So if it was a physical aggression, then that would take priority. Here I'm going to think about the patient care, so it's going to be something around the nature of the delay and whether there's anything I can do. Then I'm going to think about the staff, making sure they're safe, and also afterwards making sure that they're okay. I'm going to need to diffuse the situation in some way, and also I would like to make it clear that there was a multidisciplinary approach that I've spoken to the nurse in charge as well. So that's the kind of broad way I would think about it. And when it comes to the steps in my answer is going to be, my first priority in dealing with this case was to think about the safety of the patient and the safety of my staff. Actually, at that point, the family had gone back into the waiting room, so there wasn't any ongoing aggression or conflict to deal with urgently, so I had time to plan and implement my approach. First thing I did was to think about the actual situation around the delay. So was it an unreasonable delay, and was there anything I could do about it? And they had been waiting for a long time. They had been waiting for longer than we would have hoped, but actually it was because the specialist had been caught up with other emergencies going on elsewhere in the hospital. I think it was important to do that so they were aware of the urgency of the situation, but also aware of the situation that they were going to be coming into here. Actually, the specialty team were coming to ED at that point, they said they would be there within 15 minutes. So I knew I had a time frame to relay back to the family. I then, before I went out to speak to the family, I spoke to the nurse in charge to explain what had happened, make sure we were on the same page, and outline the plan that I was going to go and talk to them and explain what had happened. And I think it's really important, both team leaders, to be on the same page and have a same mental model as to how things are going to go, particularly if it was going to escalate, so that someone else, senior who's on, knew what was going to happen. I also spoke to the staff just to check what else had happened, because I only may have caught a little bit of it, and to check that they were okay, because it's not nice when you're in a conflict with someone. It's certainly not nice being shouted at by families. It's not what we're there to do. So I made sure that they were being adequately supported and that I had all the information. And then I went out to speak to the family. I called them into a room so that we were able to speak to each other away from the waiting room. And I explained, I did say that I was sorry that they'd been waiting so long. I completely understood how frustrating it was, but that it's not acceptable to shout at our nursing staff. And it's also not going to help get things done any more quickly. The father was actually apologetic. They just explained that they were just really frustrated and worried about their child, which of course we know, but sometimes it's helpful just to speak in that environment and say something. And I explained that actually the specialty team was coming down in 15 minutes. I think at the end of this conversation, the family knew that it wasn't acceptable to behave that way. They knew that there was a plan. They'd received an apology for the wait, and they had also had the opportunity to voice their concerns because they spoke about how they were feeling about their child and how worried and stressed they were. So that would be an example answer to that stage of the question. The last stage is outcome. What went well? What's changed your practice? How do you reflect on what happened? Here, you're wanting to show that you have taken something away. Yes, you handled the situation well, that's what you're wanting to show, but also that something has changed your practice. It might help prevent a similar scenario, or maybe something that you would do better next time is totally fine as well. When you're planning this in advance, think about what the outcome of your examples that you're sharing might be. In my example, the outcome was the family went back to the waiting room and waited for the 15 minutes, and actually the specialty team did come in that time. And the father, who had been the person who was being aggressive, did actually apologise to the nursing staff, which was a nice outcome. It wasn't a necessary outcome, but it was good, and I think it was a reflection on how well it was handled by the team as well as by the people who were on the receiving end of the aggression. I think for me, since that incident, I've been more proactive when I've led a team of trying to get specialty teams down, being more proactive when there's a delay, and if that delay is longer than it should be, then I make a point of calling the team, liaising with them more regularly, checking what the delay is and if there's anything I can do to help get them down. So when I share that answer, I'm showing that it's a common problem in ED, and I have actually learned to be proactive, and that's improved my leadership skills. I'm sure you can think of ways that my answer could be improved, and it's really hard to deliver a perfect answer, but what I've tried is to pick an example that is common, where I had a clear role, where I took clear steps and knew what my role was and what steps I had to take, and that had an outcome that I could reflect on and improve something with. There are no perfect examples. You're going to come up with your examples and your answers, and actually you might think of ways that I could present my scenario or my answer better, and that's fine. What I'm trying to do is to get you to think about how to choose good examples and how to deliver the answers in this IMSO framework so that you know you've taken a structured approach. What you want to avoid is spending 2.5 minutes talking about the story and 30 seconds talking about what you did. Bonus points, and the reason that you'll impress the interviewers is not because of the story. It's going to be MSO in IMSO. It's going to be the mission. It's going to be what steps you took. It's going to be what outcome and learning you had. You should be using loads of examples in your interviews to help add authenticity and add weight to the things you're trying to illustrate about yourself, as well as using them in these specific questions. Have your examples ready. Think about the IMSO framework and how you're going to use that to answer your questions, and then you'll be all set to help focus on delivering the best answer possible in your interview.